Greetings, friends, and welcome to this podcast interview with Sara Wenger Shenk, former president of Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary, and an author of a multitude of books and articles about the church and the kingdom and about youth. And Sara, it's delightful to have you here with us today. And one of the places I'd like you to start after you introduce yourself to us further is you've been doing some thinking about why the church and some sharing more broadly about that. And that ties in very closely with some of the reflection I've been doing over the last year on what is God up to in the church? Is there purpose for the church? What is the Spirit doing? So if you'd introduce yourself and then share with us some of your reflections. And thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Conrad, for this opportunity to share from my experience, from the privilege I have had of being a child of the church and growing ever more in love with the one that called me and named me, my creator, my redeemer, my sustainer. So thank you. I have a very churched background, but in many expressions of the church. So many, in fact, I often wonder where I belong. So when I reflect on why the church dismantled, recovering, restoring the kingdom, it takes me back a bit through my own personal history. I was born in Ethiopia. My parents were missionary educators. And so my early experiences of church were gathering of the Mennonite missionary team for prayer meetings, worship with fellow missionary children at a missionary boarding school, included Presbyterians, Baptists, Lutherans, Mennonites, others. Of course, worshiping with the emerging Ethiopian church, preaching in Amharic. And then as a 12-year-old, moving with my family to southeastern Pennsylvania, to Lancaster Conference, and sort of the abrupt immersion in a conservative Mennonite subculture, going to a large Mennonite church that our family, my father and mother, decided was not serving their children's needs, and so moving to another sort of newer church that was also serving the deaf community. Spent about 5 years there before moving on to college, not doing a lot of church during college, but growing in profound ways in my spirituality, including a year at Wheaton College, where I became acquainted with Thomas Merton, and a kind of spirituality that spoke to my inner being in a way that the more sort of discipleship-oriented, behavioral-oriented formation that I had as a Mennonite hadn't. And that was transformative for me, Thomas Merton, and sort of the spiritual masters, some of the mystics, have fed me over the years. After college, off to Pasadena, California for seminary. My husband and I together, Gerald Shenk. No Mennonite churches nearby, so we attended Episcopalian, Congregational, Evangelical, Quaker congregations. Then off to, for what amounted to close to 9 years, with Eastern Mennonite Mission and Mennonite Central Committee in Eastern Europe, in the former Yugoslavia. Again, no Mennonites in the country. We worshiped and served and taught beside Baptists, Pentecostals, Lutherans, Catholics in that setting. One of the most formative congregational experiences I had was at Reba Place Church. We had a young family at that time, and there was a great deal of artistic expression, original music, dance, drama. Our kids loved sitting on the front rows in that congregation that was communitarian household, fellowship-based, and very much engaged with the neighborhood of Evanston, Illinois. Later, moved to Harrisonburg, Virginia, and there, my husband first, and then I also joined the faculty and administration at Eastern Mennonite Seminary. We worshiped with Community Mennonite Church, but 2 times pushed out and started new churches, and did a lot of thinking about, I've always felt sort of like pushing out the walls, just not content, or shall I say restless with conventional church. Asking all kinds of questions. Why do we sit in rows and look at the backs of each other's heads? Why are we mainly passive participants when we go to church, and singing occasionally, but on and on. Wrote, thought a lot about how do you create congregational life, family life, what kind of culture will form faith in vibrant, life-giving, authentic ways. And so 2 times pushed out, started new churches, one of which we explicitly called an experimental church. We're not going to try to be a full service with all kinds of programs, congregation. Our focus was on the Lord's Supper and practicing the Lord's Supper every Sunday on a weekly basis, the Lord's table and round our tables for, we called ourselves a table church. And that was very exciting. Got a grant and brought in, we rooted ourselves deeply in the biblical and theological understandings of the Lord's table, and then approached it many different ways in our body and worship life together. Went for 9 years to Elkhart, participated in the Prairie Street Mennonite Church, but traveled widely in MC Canada, MC USA, and beyond. So it's all kinds of congregations working hard to be the body of Christ in their particular neighborhoods. Now recently moved to Virginia, retired, and joined the local rural congregation, Springdale Mennonite, and will likely be moving into some leadership for Virginia Conference. So yeah, why church? When I feel very restless with conventional church, and a big part of that has to do with how we talk about our faith, how we individually and corporately speak about God and God's activity in the world, God's activity in our lives, and which, just to cut to the most recent project, the TongueTied, I'll hold it up, the new book, TongueTied, Learning the Lost Art of Talking About Faith. I grew up in a family life and in schools where I learned a deep, rich, multi-splendored language for describing faith, some of which was, I would describe as Christianese. It was like formulaic code speak that you only understand in certain subcultures. But much of it was also poetic and expansive and hospitable and gracious and humble and wise. And I think, how do we, over the generations, how do I, with my children who are now grown and have their own children, so with my grandchildren now and with my neighbors, with those I encounter, how do we as congregations use the language of faith in ways that are truthful, genuine, honest, have integrity, ring true with our lives, that we're not mouthing words, that we're not trying to fill in the blanks or say it right or remember the formulas. But in vulnerability, grasping for how do I describe my wonderings about the divine, my experiences of the holy, those moments of transcendence. What I describe first off in the book are why we've gone tongue-tied. It's an enormously complex subject, and I don't know a whole lot about it, frankly, but I'm awfully curious why so many of us, if we're not sort of in our own little subgroup that gets our Christianese, have gone silent. You know, it was a good friend, in fact, Richard Kaufman, who you've had on your program, said to me one day, he said, Sarah, you know, even in church circles, people I talk with, you so readily describe the latest movie they've seen, talk about sports, even politics, you know, what recipes they're doing, what, you know, anything but talking about how we have seen God shown up, how we've experienced God, how we wonder or are disappointed in God. So, you know, this is something I've written about and talked about and wondered about for most of my adult life. And this got me hooked again. And I said, okay, I'm going to do another dive. What is making it so hard for some of us, many of whom are educated, but for so many of us to talk in genuine ways about what we see and hear, what we think we know. It may be, I mean, there's all kinds of reasons, and I explore them at length, but, you know, a lot of the faith talk we hear is sort of glib, out of touch with reality, or with a kind of pious veneer that doesn't connect with real moral issues of our day, like racism, sexism, climate change, political church polarization. So it feels out of touch, feels like a virtual artificial reality, the disconnect. So that may make it difficult for some of us who want to be honest and vulnerable to talk about faith. It may be because we truly find God incomprehensible. You know, there is so much that we don't know, and yet we presume to know, oh, God said this and God did that and so on. That, you know, without appropriate humility about acknowledging, well, this is what I have seen and heard. But, you know, with Job, I really don't know anything when it comes down to it about who God is. God is mysterious and incomprehensible. So who are we to presume to talk about God? It's also the case that so much talk about God has been hurtful, hateful, hypocritical, and judgmental. So we want nothing to do with it. And we've got so much of that out and about now. And many of it, you know, are very religious people who are using religious words in ways that we just say, count me out. I am not going there. Yeah, and then there's also the sort of Christianese I was talking about. There's the right way to talk about God, and don't you dare say something wrong. You know, this is who God is, and this is how you're supposed to talk about God, and this is what the Bible says. So again, it, you know, shuts us down. I think one of the biggest issues, maybe we just don't see it modeled well. We've heard, you know, we just haven't heard faith talked about in ways that feel trustworthy, down to earth, embodied, you know, and honest. So then I explore in the book after we get in touch, which I think is the first step, with why we're reluctant, what is it that's tying up our tongues, those of us who find it a challenge. And then, talk about why it matters to talk about faith, which is a whole arena that we could spend a good bit of time on, why it matters. And then how to do it with more freedom, honesty, humility, and authenticity. And that is where I spend most of the time in the book. But let me pause and see if you wanted to follow up with some questions or probe.
Yeah, there's so much, Sarah, that I connect with, and I have several questions. When did you first awaken to this kind of reality that, like, you remember how old you were when you recognized this incongruity between what people said they were or church was, but what it really was? I mean, there's this kind of disconnect that you keep describing. How did that happen for you?
Well, I think, as I mentioned, how a sort of ethical, discipleship-oriented ethos of my formation, which is a wonderful gift to me, but the disconnect between that and a sort of heartfelt love, that a devotion that grew out of a spirituality, a depth of spirituality. It wasn't with everyone, but it was quite prevalent. And yeah, those who did talk in a more sort of what we say pious way used language that my skeptical brain would say, now wait a minute, how do you know God said that? And so, questioning and wanting to reflect on a very sort of too easy, in my view, assumption or presumption about what God was doing in the world. So how did I get in touch? I remember I remember, for instance, sitting with a fellow missionary when Gerald and I first went to Yugoslavia, he was an old timer, and he sat down and he said, "Tell me about your call." And I thought, oh wow, call. This was a huge thing for my parents' generation, their sense of call. And I was more pragmatic and less able to talk, or maybe less in touch with how God was a part of what we were choosing to do. And I was just like, oh my, I don't understand that language. And what is a call? It's just an example of a word that I have worked with a whole lot over my life. So when I came to seminary and they started saying, when I came finally after, because I'd been writing a variety of books, someone thought maybe I could teach a course. And then you start showing up, and there was a chapel, and we were to get into little groups and reflect on our call, our calling. And I thought, oh my, here we are again. This has to do with vocation. It has to do with who I'm made to be. This has to do with some sense of God's Spirit at work in my life, aligning with my particular giftings and all of this. But I've also had this sort of, whoa, this is an overly spiritualized word, and I've got to unpack it. And this became, of course, a primary part of our work at the seminary, was to help people get inside this word and get inside of many words. How do you humanize them? How do you bring them down to earth and talk about them with skin on not as a sort of fossilized, one size fits all, but as something that has skin and grounding. So I remember in that particular conversation saying, well, I'm not sure what precisely my job is, what I'm called to do. I've never been very clear about what specific work I'm called to do. My best sense of my call is to integrity. And that for me was liberating, because it was a way of being in the world that fit me. It wasn't a sort of, oh, you are called to be a missionary, which is a noble call. And I don't mean in any way to demean people, the variety of ways people use this word. But for me, it was called to a way of being in the world.
And can you say you've described it well up to this point just by how you've lived your life, but that word integrity for you means what? How do you capture that word?
This is great. Integrity for me means a kind of resonance and alignment of body, mind, and spirit, and a transparency and honesty that, another word, humility. And we talk a lot about being humble, or you gotta be Rosemary Radford Ruther, who is a renowned theologian, feminist theologian, had a class with her at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary. She gave me a definition of humility that she said, it's not about being down on yourself, it's about realistic self-knowledge. And that for me is at the heart of authentic talk about God. There is a kind of realism that says, this is what I know. This is what I've experienced. This is what I've heard. These are the wells I draw from, the wisdom tradition, the scriptures, and from science and the experiential data of how we live. These are the wells I draw from. And I want to be honest with you. I want to be transparent, realistic, what I know and what I don't know, what I think I'm good at and what I'm not good at, where I've fallen short, where I think I've done, some worthy things. So yes, calling
That's wonderful.
to integrity and yeah.
I struggled for years until the last couple of years, and partly coming out of my Parkinson's diagnosis, with my just finally being comfortable with the body I'm living in, even though it's not, it's itself being dismantled. And something happened to my relationship with my students. They suddenly began to resonate with me as a human being rather than just a scholar teacher.
Yeah, look at that.
We now have lots of conversations about my faith, and I will start off this way. I will say, this is my experience. I don't expect it to necessarily be yours or for you to, own what I'm saying, or I'm not putting this on you, but this is my experience. And then I'll talk about my faith. And that has been such a way in to conversations with them. They don't feel coerced. They don't feel pressured. They don't feel demeaned. It's just, we're having a conversation about the things that are important to us. And that has just been a wonderful space to be. And it sounds like you're talking about that kind of thing, Sarah.
Yeah, that's a perfect illustration. Yes.
So why don't you tell us more about what you write in terms of how to do this and why it's important?
Yeah, well, one of, I line out, describe and illustrate several principles that I think can guide us for talking, learning to talk honestly, freely about faith in ways that are grounded and real and embodied. First off is to listen, to always listen first. Listen. First, listen to each other, to our own bodies, to the wisdom tradition, the scriptures, to the still small voice of the Spirit, to the voices insisting that Black Lives Matter, to our rivers, the watershed in which we live, the birds, the trees. By listening first, we learn to pay attention to how God is present everywhere and in everyone. So our listening becomes, in a way, a prayer that is opening up our senses to sense how God is present, how God calls us into action. And in a way, it's just tuning in, because we don't often talk about God because we're not even paying attention. We're practical atheists. We don't expect God to show up. So listening first is a way of tuning in all dimensions of life, rather than assuming we know, or imposing our own certainties, anxieties, or whatever it is onto a situation. And when we're tuned in, then the second principle I talked about is learning to submit to the mystery. That yes, God is incomprehensible, and becoming humble in the face of that, and grateful for the ways that, despite how unfathomable God is, we have so much evidence that God has been at work and is at work, continues to work in our world. So by submitting to the mystery, we become both, yes, humble, but that humble, and that makes us bold, if you will. This grounded in realism and a recognition of what we don't know can make us bold and able to more freely share what we have seen and heard and suspect and want tested by others because of our own capacity to get it, so to be so off base. And yeah, a part of that submission to mystery is the great gift of curiosity. I make a big deal of that rather than coming with sort of a set idea, we have this gift of curiosity that keeps inviting us to open things up with questions and wonderings and for those of us who are rooted and grounded in the story of the gospel of Jesus, this is not a risky business. This is a wonderful business to be explorers in the rather than definers and containers. Thirdly, and this the whole book sort of revolves around, is that at its core, faith is a love story. Talking about faith is all about this attachment, this love attachment that is at the root of genuine faith. And it doesn't, it may be our disappointment in love. It may be our feeling somehow cut off or adrift, longing for that love. But it is all about a love story. And as we all know, when you fall in love, you just can't keep quiet. You have to find words. You have to find ways to describe it, sing about it, write poetry about it. I talk about holding together, and this, what are often seen as opposites. It is in the tension of holding different perspectives together that we achieve new understanding and see how there are truth in multiple perspectives. And finally, I talk about learning to tell each other stories about where we believe God has shown up. Talking about where we sense God and see God at work. There's a book I read on testimonies and practice of testimonies that Lillian Daniel, the author, said, I had to say, when we agreed as a congregation to learn this practice of testimony, that it is talking about how an experience from the weekend, you cannot omit God. As she said, that may sound rather strange for a congregation, but we do that all the time. We talk about things without mentioning God. And she talked and I describe this in the book, how it opened up her congregation in lots of ways to even over coffee describe God at work. And I just yesterday got from a good friend of mine, Jane Pfeiffer, who's a spiritual director. She said, in my work as a spiritual companion, a relationship where there is permission and encouragement to talk about one's faith, I find over and over again that many folks have significant experiences with the divine in the ordinariness of their lives, but they do not recognize it as such, or they truly can't find words to describe what happened in them. So this, what happened in them or to them, this practice of telling each other, I call it, I think, storied holy ground, cultivating this practice in any number of ways to bring to voice times when we long for God, have been disappointed with God, suspect that God showed up, are grateful for the provision that was given. I think it all begins, this talk about faith, with learning to say thank you, because everything is gift. So yes, those are some of the ways that I explore the principles that sort of thread through the various chapters which deal with how it's people who have had the hardest time, who often are the best teachers, often minority groups, people who've been marginalized, who've struggled incredibly. They have authentic voices that we often only parrot. And beauty is a tremendous gift from the Creator. Beauty will save the world, Dostoevsky said. And the beauty of the gospel, yes, and getting reacquainted with science and how it opens up our eyes to so much of what God has been doing. Prayer, learning to pray again. These are all ways that we move into faith and try to find words to wrap around that are honest and grounded in our embodied experience.
Sara, this is delightful. There's so much I would love to connect more with, because I think as I've podcasted over the last year, and a lot of it is really this transition in my body with Parkinson's disease has been the trigger for me, has been
there you go.
And so to connect it with what you're saying, I hadn't quite put the two together, but it has made me more human.
Yes.
And it's also made me more vulnerable. Yes. I feel the vulnerability all of the time at lots of different levels.
Yeah.
But I'm also more content with who I am than I've ever been before. And so
look at that.
And there's something about that people sense, I think, around you. And I just, again, I think of my students who come to the classroom without much of a faith journey. But where I start with them is just to say to them, your life is sacred. You know, whether you believe that God exists or not, I just want to say to you, your life is a sacred life. Your life is a set apart life. Your life is and because I think for them, they take for granted their lives, and they're not sure they even have a story that's worth telling. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if it's not true for many in the church too, that we're just not sure our story is worth telling. And so you're just doing a wonderful work here. Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, it's a joy. And
I can tell it is.
Thank you for bringing it back to our shared humanity. This is where we really can talk faith, when we get in touch with our own humanness and that we have in common with everyone.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Sara, I hate to cut us off, but thank you. It's been a delight to have you here. This will post on Monday. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Conrad, and blessings to you.
All right, and blessings to you
this
too.
Opportunity.
Yeah, and to our audience, you can see this on my YouTube channel, Conrad Knigge, or it will also be posted as a podcast, audio podcast on A Church Dismantled, A Kingdom Restored. My guest has been Sara Wenger Shenk. Thank you, Sara. Blessings.
You're welcome. Thank you.